It was late, and the faint hum of the refrigerator was the only noise interrupting the silence in the kitchen. I had just finished stacking the dishes, wiping down the counters, and ensuring everything was in place. There was a certain comfort in the routine, the predictability of it all. But that night, nothing seemed certain. As I reached for the light switch, I sensed something, an imperceptible change in the atmosphere behind me, as if someone were present. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned abruptly, expecting nothing but empty space. Instead, I froze. A man was standing in the doorway, a stranger. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze pierced through me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't recognize him, had never seen him before, but there he was, still, silent and undeniably real. "I didn't mean to frighten you," he said, his voice smooth and carrying an unexpected warmth that made me hesitate. His casual demeanor didn't match the unease I felt, though something about his presence seemed oddly out of place. I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something I didn't. "Oh, no problem," I replied, trying to keep my voice light, although my pulse was racing. "I didn't hear you come in. I thought I was alone." He smirked, as though sensing my discomfort, but remained silent, offering no reply. He just stood there, watching, like he was waiting for something, or perhaps testing me. I fumbled for something to break the silence that was thickening rapidly between us. "You, want something to eat?" I asked awkwardly, gesturing toward the half-cleaned counter. It was an odd thing to say, but the words escaped before I could stop them. He shrugged, a small smile curling at the corner of his lips. "Sure, why not?" I turned back to the fridge, pulling out a few things, all the while feeling his gaze lingering on me. It was that same strange, familiar look, mixed with something else I couldn't quite identify. But I didn't let it deter me. I kept busy, hoping the act of cooking would return me to the normal rhythm I had lost the moment he arrived. As I began chopping, I couldn't resist asking, "So what brings you here?" He paused for a moment, almost as if deciding whether or not to answer. Finally, he spoke. "Got a little lost on the way, I suppose." There was a certain vagueness to his words, but his tone suggested there was more behind it. Our conversation flowed naturally after that, but there was an underlying mystery that lingered, unspoken. The way he looked at me, the subtle pauses between his words, he seemed to be waiting for me to catch on to something I couldn't quite grasp, and that made me feel nervous in a way I hadn't anticipated. The kitchen, once a place of routine, now felt charged, as though every movement held more weight. I noticed small details, the way he leaned a bit too close, the warmth of his arm brushing against mine as he reached for a spoon, the almost tangible tension building between us. There was something magnetic, something undeniable, pulling us closer, even though we both tried to keep it casual. As our laughter filled the room, I began to sense something unfamiliar creeping into the air. It was in the way his gaze lingered a little longer, the subtle change in his voice, as if we were both aware of an unspoken current passing between us, but too cautious to acknowledge it. It was thrilling and nerve-wracking, like standing at the edge of a cliff, wondering if I should take the step forward. At some point, he took the knife from my hands, his fingers brushing mine. "Here, let me do that," he murmured, his voice low. It was such a simple gesture, but there was an intimacy in it that surprised me. I hadn't realized how close we had become until then, standing side by side in the dim light of the kitchen. He began chopping, and I watched him, unable to resist the quiet intensity he brought to something as mundane as slicing vegetables. The rhythm of his movements, the quiet confidence he exuded, it was mesmerizing. I felt myself getting drawn in, momentarily forgetting the strangeness of his sudden presence. Somehow, in that small act, he had managed to shift the balance, taking control in a way that left me both intrigued and a little unsteady. We fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the soft chopping of the knife against the cutting board. I leaned against the counter, watching him, feeling a strange pull that was both exciting and unsettling. But I didn't want to break the spell. I didn't want to disrupt whatever fragile connection had formed between us. Then, just as I thought I had a handle on it, he glanced up, catching my gaze. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. He held my gaze, his expression unreadable, before finally breaking into a small smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "There's something about this place," he murmured, almost to himself. Feels familiar. His words lingered in the air, thick with an emotion I couldn't quite place. The way he said it made me feel as if I were part of a secret, something the two of us shared. I wanted to ask him what he meant, to dig deeper, but the intensity of his gaze held me captive. In that moment, it felt as though the walls of the kitchen had closed in, leaving just the two of us on the brink of something I didn't fully understand. But whatever it was, I couldn't deny that I wanted to find out. The days that followed blurred into a pattern I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't like we had made plans to see each other again, yet somehow he seemed to show up whenever I least expected it, as if he knew exactly when to appear, like he could read my thoughts before I even had them. It wasn't something I was used to, and as much as I tried to brush it off, I couldn't ignore the strange anticipation building within me. I would catch myself waiting for the sound of his voice, the familiar scrape of the kitchen chair as he sat down, his eyes meeting mine across the room with that quiet, knowing look that always left me on edge. It was unsettling, in a way that both thrilled and frightened me. No matter how hard I tried to act unaffected, I knew I was caught. We both were, though neither of us dared to say it out loud. The tension between us grew heavier, an unspoken presence I could feel even when he wasn't around. It clung to me like a secret I didn't know how to share. Maybe that was part of the allure, the secrecy, the thrill of something unspoken hanging in the air. It was there in the way he looked at me, in the subtle, almost accidental touches that left me breathless and a little unsteady. One evening, he appeared again, just as I was about to close up. The sight of him, leaning casually in the doorway, his face illuminated only by the dim kitchen light, made my heart race. He had a way of making even the smallest gestures feel significant, as if there were layers to everything he did, secrets I wasn't meant to unravel. Yet, I found myself yearning to. Without saying a word, he entered the kitchen, moving closer. His face was unreadable, and I could feel the atmosphere shift between us, thickening with a tension that was nearly tangible. It was as though we were engaged in some silent dance, every move deliberate, neither of us wanting to disrupt the delicate equilibrium that had somehow emerged. I glanced up and met his gaze, feeling an odd flutter in my stomach. His eyes locked with mine, a quiet intensity simmering just beneath the surface, and for a brief moment, everything else faded. It was just the two of us standing there in the small kitchen, the stillness heavy with unspoken words. "So you keep showing up here?" I said, forcing a smile to break the silence, though my heart was racing in my chest. He didn't respond immediately, merely tilting his head slightly, his eyes never leaving mine. "Maybe I have a reason," he replied, his voice low, carrying a weight that made my pulse race. There was something in the way he spoke, an assurance that left no room for doubt, and I felt myself drawn to him, helpless against it. I swallowed, searching for something to say, but the words seemed to stick in my throat. I didn't want to admit the effect he had on me, didn't want to acknowledge how my body reacted to each of his movements, but I knew he could sense it. He could see it in the way I held his gaze just a little too long, in how my breath caught whenever he was near. And as much as I wanted to deny it, I realized I was falling, trapped in a current I didn't know how to escape. But before I could speak, he took a step closer, closing the distance between us. His hand brushed mine, just a fleeting touch, but it sent a shiver down my spine, sparking a fire that had been smoldering beneath the surface. I felt myself lean into him, drawn by an invisible force, a need both thrilling and terrifying. "Why do you keep coming back?" I whispered, my voice barely audible, as though speaking too loudly might break the fragile bond between us. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and for a moment I thought he might pull away. But instead, he leaned in, his breath warm against my skin. "Maybe I'm waiting for you to let me in," he murmured, his words laced with a promise that left me breathless. The weight of his gaze, the quiet intensity of his voice, it was all too much, and yet not enough. I wanted more, needed more, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. The air between us thickened with unspoken longing, a tension that had been building for days, weeks, and now finally it felt like it was about to break. But just as I was about to close the distance, to let myself fall, a sudden sound shattered the silence, breaking the moment like glass. We both froze, exchanging a look of surprise, and the spell was broken. He stepped back, the tension between us shifting, replaced by a sudden, inexplicable unease that left me feeling vulnerable. I could see it in his eyes, the way his gaze darkened, his jaw clenched as he struggled to regain his composure. And just like that, the warmth between us turned cold, replaced by a chill that sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't understand it, didn't know why he suddenly seemed so distant, as if he were pulling away even while standing right in front of me. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, but he didn't answer. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable, and for a moment I felt a flicker of fear, a sense that something was slipping away, something I couldn't grasp. He turned his gaze away, looking toward the doorway, as though seeing something I couldn't, something only he could understand. The room felt colder, the once warm atmosphere now tainted with something darker. A tension that had nothing to do with the desire simmering between us, an invisible battle I couldn't see, a war waging within him that had spilled over into our quiet world. I reached out, hoping to close the distance between us, to pull him back from whatever edge he was standing on. But he stepped away, his jaw tight as though holding something back. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice barely audible, as though speaking to himself rather than to me. And in that moment, I realized there was so much more to him than I'd ever known. Layers of pain, years of experiences I hadn't even begun to understand. He turned to leave, his movements tense, as though he were being pulled by an invisible force. I felt a pang of loss, a deep ache settling within me. But just as he reached the doorway, he paused, his hand lingering on the frame. For a moment, I thought he might turn back, that he might stay, that he might finally let me in. But he didn't. Without a word, he slipped into the shadows, leaving me alone in the empty kitchen. The silence pressed down on me like an unbearable weight. As I stood there, the echoes of our time together lingered in the air. I realized whatever was happening between us was far from over. The story hadn't ended. It was just beginning. And deep down, I knew I was in too deep to turn back. I was entangled in a web of emotions I didn't understand, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the sensation that he would return, that he would always be there, just out of reach. As I leaned against the counter, gazing into the vacant space where he had stood, I silently promised myself that no matter what, I would find a way to understand him, to uncover the mystery hidden in those dark, unreadable eyes. But I knew, deep down, it wouldn't be easy. It had been days since that charged evening in the kitchen, yet his memory lingered. The intensity of his gaze, the enigma hanging between us, remained fresh in my mind. Every time I entered the kitchen, I half expected to see him there, leaning against the counter, watching me with that quiet intensity that had become both comforting and exciting. Then one night, he appeared. I hadn't heard him come in or felt his presence until I turned around and there he was, standing just a few feet away, his expression as unreadable as ever. My heart skipped, the air in the room thickening as our eyes met. For a moment, it felt as though time had paused, as though the world outside had vanished. "I thought you weren't coming back," I whispered, barely audible, but he heard me. His gaze softened, a flicker of something unspoken dancing in his eyes as he took a step closer. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, the quiet energy that had always drawn me in. As he closed the distance between us, I found myself succumbing to the pull, the inevitability of it all. His hand reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face, and the tenderness of the gesture caught me off guard. There was something different about him tonight, a vulnerability in his touch that I hadn't noticed before. It was as if he were lowering his defenses, allowing me to see past the walls he'd built around himself. I looked up, my breath catching as his eyes met mine. For a moment, we stood in silence, suspended in a moment that felt both delicate and powerful. I could feel the warmth of his hand against my cheek, the soft caress of his fingers against my skin, and in that instant I knew what was happening between us was real. Without a word, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was gentle, almost tentative, as if he were gauging my response, waiting to see if I would pull away. But I didn't. I leaned into him, my arms wrapping around his shoulders, feeling the tension fade as we melted into each other. The world around us vanished. and all I could feel was him. The warmth of his body pressed against mine, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my hands. There was something tender, almost reverent, in the way he held me, as though I were something precious, something to be cherished. It was an unexpected feeling, yet it felt so natural, so right. His hands found mine, our fingers intertwining as he pulled me closer, deepening the kiss. In that moment, I felt a bond that went beyond words, beyond logic. It was as if we had found something in each other, something neither of us had known we were seeking. Our bodies moved together, swaying in a rhythm that was both familiar and new, as if we were two halves of a whole finally coming together. There was a quiet intensity in his touch, a warmth that seeped into my skin, filling me with a peace I hadn't realized I needed. His hands traced my arms, gentle yet firm, grounding me in the moment as we sank deeper into each other. I could feel the strength in his shoulders, the silent power in his movements. When I looked up, I saw the vulnerability in his eyes, a softness that took my breath away. We didn't speak, didn't need to. Everything we felt, everything we wanted to say, was conveyed in the silence, in the gentle caress of our lips, the warmth of his hands holding mine. It was a connection that transcended words, a bond that felt as if it had always been there, waiting for us to discover it. I felt the warmth radiating from him, the quiet hum of his breath against my skin as we held each other, lost in the moment. There was something sacred in the silence, a tenderness that filled the air. And as we stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, I knew that I had found something rare, something I didn't want to let go of. We stayed like that, gently swaying in the soft light of the kitchen, our breaths mingling in the quiet. The world outside faded into a distant memory. It was just us, caught in a moment that felt both infinite and fleeting. As the minutes passed, a sense of peace washed over me, a quiet joy that I hadn't felt in a long time. He brushed his lips against my cheek, a soft, feathery touch that sent a shiver down my spine. And as he pulled me closer, I felt a warmth spread through me, filling me with a sense of belonging I hadn't realized I was missing. It was a feeling I couldn't explain, a quiet certainty that I was exactly where I was meant to be. We shared tender kisses, each one lingering a little longer, each one carrying a promise that went beyond words. It was as if we were speaking a language only we could understand, a silent conversation that filled the air with a warmth that surrounded us, binding us together in a way that felt both fragile and unbreakable. The room was quiet, the only sounds being the soft hum of the fridge and the gentle rhythm of our breaths mingling in the silence. As we held each other, I knew I had found something I didn't want to lose. Lost in the moment, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet joy that filled the empty spaces in my heart. There was no need for words, no need to fill the silence with explanations or promises. Everything we felt, everything we wanted to say, was conveyed in the gentle touch of his hand, the warmth of his embrace. It was a connection that surpassed logic, a bond that felt as though it had been waiting for us to find it all along. We stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the world outside fading into a distant memory. And for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. It was a feeling I didn't want to let go of. I hadn't anticipated such a serene certainty that I had discovered something genuine, something I didn't want to release. As the evening passed, we remained there, our breaths intertwining in the stillness, our hearts beating in sync. And as I gazed up, I saw the same emotion reflected in his eyes, a warmth that filled me with a sense of tranquility, a soft happiness that I knew I would carry with me long after the night was finished. In that moment, I understood that whatever came next, whatever obstacles lay ahead, we would face them side by side. It was a pledge, an unspoken promise that required no words. As we embraced, wrapped in the comfort of the kitchen, I felt a sense of hope blossom within me, a quiet belief that we had found something worth preserving. The outside world was peaceful, the night stretching before us like a pledge. And as we stayed there, lost in each other, I knew that I had found something rare, something I would treasure for the rest of my life. It was a feeling that transcended words, a connection that filled the empty spaces of my heart. As I held him close, I felt a gentle joy settle over me, a peace I hadn't realized I was missing. We remained like that, wrapped in each other's embrace, our hearts beating in unison. As the minutes passed, I knew that whatever lay ahead, we would face it together. It was a bond that transcended language, a connection that filled the atmosphere with a warmth that enveloped us, uniting us in a way that felt both delicate and unshakable. As the first light of dawn entered the kitchen, casting a soft glow, I realized that I had discovered something worth holding on to, a love that defied logic, beyond explanation. It was a quiet certainty, a feeling that filled me with a sense of peace, a happiness I knew would stay with me long after the night ended. After that evening, it felt as if the world had subtly shifted, like everything was familiar, yet somehow altered. I moved through my days with a calmness I hadn't experienced before, a quiet contentment that lingered long after he left. Still, beneath it all, there was a restlessness, a sense that I was waiting for something, though I couldn't put it into words. He didn't come by daily. His visits were irregular, often appearing when I least expected it. Yet each time, he brought with him the same energy, the same unspoken intensity that filled the room as soon as he stepped into it. It was as if he had become woven into the fabric of my life, appearing like a shadow, a presence that felt both familiar and enigmatic. One evening, I was alone in the kitchen, reflecting on the events that had unfolded between us, the quiet intimacy we shared, the way he looked at me as though I were the only person in the world. Just as I was about to lose myself in thought, I felt it, a familiar shift in the air, the almost imperceptible sensation that he was near. I turned, and there he was, standing at the doorway, his expression softer than I had ever seen, a subtle gentleness in his eyes, as if he were allowing me to see a side of him he typically kept hidden. Without saying a word, he approached, closing the gap between us in a way that felt both inevitable and extraordinary. His hand reached out, grazing my arm, and I felt a warmth spread through me, filling me with a quiet joy that left me breathless. "You're here," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He smiled, a soft, almost nostalgic expression crossing his face. "Always," he replied, his voice low, as though he were confessing something only the two of us could understand. And in that instant, it felt as though the world outside didn't exist, as if we were the only two people in existence, bound together by something invisible, something unbreakable. We moved through the kitchen together, a silent rhythm that had become second nature. As we shared small moments, I realized just how much he had become a part of my life. It was the little things, the way he would catch my hand as we passed, the quiet smiles we exchanged, the unspoken understanding that lingered between us. It was a bond that went beyond words, a connection that filled the air with a warmth I hadn't known was possible. But tonight, something was different, something heavier, as though he were holding back, as if there was something he wanted to say but couldn't. I felt it in the way he moved, the way his gaze lingered on me just a little longer, a quiet tension simmering just beneath the surface. I reached out, my fingers brushing against his arm, and he looked at me, his eyes filled with a depth I couldn't quite comprehend. There was a vulnerability there, a softness that took my breath away. For a moment, it felt as though we were on the brink of something irreversible. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice soft,